Hey everyone, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I've got a unique review for you today. We're going to check out the ZPG A1 Unicorn. And even though this is an upcoming device that hasn't fully released just yet, it probably looks very familiar, and that's because it has a striking resemblance to the Anbernic RG Cube. And we'll talk about the story behind each of these and the chicken and egg scenario that comes from them. But the one thing I've noticed over the past couple weeks of testing out the Unicorn is that I don't actually see it as being competition with the RG Cube. Even though the form factor and design is so similar and they have the exact same screen, I found that one is better with certain games over the other. And when it came down to it, after all this testing, I decided that the Unicorn is more like an upgraded version of the Powkiddy RGB30, again with a very similar screen and form factor, than the RG Cube, which I think is in a category of its own. Either way, I really like making these videos about some of the more obscure Chinese handhelds that are out there, and I hope you enjoy it too. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with an unboxing, and full disclosure, this is a review unit sent over from ZPG, but all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Also bear in mind, this is a smaller company, and so they make these devices in batches, and so the batch that I'm reviewing today may be slightly different than the one that they're launching later this month. For example, right now on the back you can see that they're offering a retro white and two transparent options, but I think some of these color options might be changing. I've seen that they're working on a pink color option, for example. And it does look like they are working on two different models, one that's 6 gigs of RAM, one that is 8, and they both have 128 gigs of internal storage. Now, as far as other specs, this has a Helio G99 CPU, and this has been used on a lot of low-end phones and tablets over the years. As far as the display, it is 4 inches with a 720 by 720 resolution. And it also has a 4500 mAh battery, which is a little bit on the small side, but I've seen that it gives me between 4 and 6 hours of battery life in mixed gameplay. One thing of note, this does support a pretty fast charge. They say 18 watts in their promotional materials, but I found that yeah, this charges pretty quickly. And finally, a couple other features worth noting. It has an internal fan and then also a gyroscope. Either way, let's take a look at what we can find inside the box. Now on the very bottom, we've got a USB-C to USB-C cable. We also have an instruction guide, both in English and in Chinese. And this is an Android-based device, and so not a lot of details here, but it at least gives you a button diagram. And then finally, we've got an inspection sticker as well as a screen protector. Okay, and taking a look at the device itself, yeah, very first impressions is that this thing looks a lot like the RG Cube. So let's talk a little bit about the story as I understand it when it comes to the ZPG A1 Unicorn and then the Anbernic RG Cube. So let's start by talking a little bit about the brand ZPG or Z Pocket Game, as well as GKD, because they are owned by the same person and his name is Lao Zhang. Now when it comes to Chinese retro handhelds, this is a pretty familiar name. It's about at the same level as Anbernic and Retroid back in the day. However, the companies that Lao Zhang uses to produce these handhelds is a lot smaller and more boutique. It's more like these small run batch of devices that are made for certain audiences. In fact, years ago I bought my own. It was called a Z Pocket Game. This was an Android-based device that kind of felt like a very squarish PS Vita. And I was really lucky in getting one. I had to stay up late and pre-order it, all that kind of stuff. And when I finally got in the hands, I realized that I didn't really want to make a video on it just because it was so hard to find. I didn't really find the point in making a whole video about something that people couldn't buy. And so I ended up auctioning this off on my charity store a couple years back. Now, for the most part, the GKD products like this Pixel that I had reviewed earlier this year, these ones are a little bit more of a larger batch, and so these are more mass-produced, commercially available devices. Meanwhile, the ZPG devices are often made just in smaller batches and sometimes just made to order. In fact, this Unicorn is the mass-produced version of one of those really small batch units that came out maybe about a year ago. And so really, this is the first Z Pocket Game device that I've seen just available on AliExpress and mass-produced. Now, there have been plans to release the A1 Unicorn for quite some time. In fact, I saw tweets about it back in November, so about 8 or 9 months ago at this point. However, it took a long time for it to come out, and by the time that the Anbernic RG Cube came out, which suspiciously looks a lot like the ZPG A1 Unicorn, this one came out first. And so all of a sudden, we have the Unicorn coming out looking like a copy of the RG Cube when it's actually the other way around. And so it is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario in that one was clearly designed before the other, but the other one actually released first, and so it does make it a little bit more confusing. And so that's the story as I understand it. The Unicorn has been in development for a long time, but the RG Cube kind of beat them to the punch when it came to actually releasing it. So I think the first thing we should talk about is just the feel of the plastic, because it does feel fairly cheap on my device right here. It feels a lot like a Powkiddy device or an older Retroid Pocket, and it's just kind of a little bit slick and slippery. I wouldn't call it a bad feeling whatsoever, but it is something that's a little bit on the cheap side, and considering that this device is probably going to be selling for around $130, it does feel a little bit cheaper than its price point. But there are some things that are unique about it. In fact, you can see there's an etching of the company logo as well as Z Pocket Game right here, and it's a really nice touch that I haven't really seen on like Anbernic devices, for example. We've seen this kind of etching on things like the Retroid Pocket 4, and yeah, I really like the look here. Now, the other big difference that I saw with this device is that it's a lot flatter than I was expecting, especially after playing with the RG Cube for the past couple months. It does have a little bit of an ergonomic grip, but it is tiny compared to the really chunky feel of the RG Cube. And so this is one of the reasons why I feel like it's a better comparison with the RGB30, just because this one has a flat back compared to these slight curves that we have here. And the reason why I think this flat back actually works pretty well is because it gives you the ability to be able to shift your hand very easily. In a very natural state, you would probably end up putting your thumb right here on the thumbstick. But, you know, for the most part, you're probably going to be playing a lot of retro games, and so you'll have to shift your hand down to be able to use the D-pad. The nice thing is that having a flat back like this means that it's very easy to shift your hand down and find a more comfortable position. And so when you're playing, yes, the left hand might be a little bit lower than the right hand, but it still feels very comfortable because this is a very tall device. Meanwhile, with the Anbernic RG Cube, you can see that we have this little indentation on these rather prominent grips. This means that you naturally are just going to put your middle finger right here. And so this is the natural way to hold the RG Cube, but when it comes to playing retro games, it's a little bit more awkward because you have to pull your index finger down to be able to reach this more comfortably. And I found when it comes to retro gaming, this position right here is just a little bit less comfortable than it is on the Unicorn. So when it comes down to it, yes, we've got this flatter back right here, but I don't think it's a bad thing, especially because I think this is geared more towards retro gaming. So now let's talk about the buttons and the rest of the I/O. We'll start with the analog sticks. So these are Nintendo Switch style Joy-Cons like we've seen before, and they have the same texture and feel to them as the Anbernic Hall sensor sticks. They have a little bit of a gritty bumper on the edges. Now, I'm not sure if these are Hall sensor sticks because, again, it's just not there in the documentation, but for all intents and purposes, it does feel like something from Anbernic or maybe even Ioneo. Now, if we go into a gamepad tester app, they feel pretty good. I feel like I have a full range of motion here, although it does feel like there's some cardinal snapping, but definitely not as bad as an Anbernic device. If anything, it feels like a slight improvement over the RG Cube, but definitely not as good as something like a Retroid Pocket or an AYN device. Okay, let's talk about this D-pad, which is obviously circular and reminds me of something like a Sega Saturn D-pad, but not quite as prominent. You can see it's a little bit on the flat side, especially when it comes to the north, south, east, and west versus the corner points. In terms of the overall feel, it has a rubber membrane underneath and rolls pretty easily. It's not loose or anything, and I wouldn't call it stiff either. So overall, from a feel of this D-pad, it feels very retro, and I don't have really any complaints about it. Now let's do a contra test. This is where I'm going to push down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right, and you can see that the character very easily moves from left and right when I use these diagonals. However, you do have to bear in mind that by virtue of being a rolling D-pad like this, that's just kind of how it is. For example, a Sega Saturn D-pad wouldn't pass this test either, and so it is very diagonal friendly, and that's just kind of inherent in these circular designs. And this is similar to the RG Cube. At face value, it does fail the contra test, but when actually playing it, I have no problem with it. If I want to hit diagonal, I can, and if I don't, I won't. And so just in general, I wouldn't mind playing contra on a device like this, even though, yeah, it doesn't pass the contra test. It still kind of does because I want to play on it. I think it's just fine. Okay, next let's try out Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. So here I want to test how easy it is to press a diagonal when I want to. And I found that when it comes to fireballs as well as hurricane kicks, it is fairly easy. But dragon punches are a little bit more challenging. And part of this has to do with the fact that I just need to train myself a little bit more to get used to this D-pad, but I did find myself missing inputs more than I thought I would. And so I would say that just naturally the RG Cube seems to be a little bit better in that regard, but it's still not terrible. So in the end, I think this is a good D-pad as long as you know what you're getting into. It is circular and does tend to roll, and it does take a little bit of work just to acclimate yourself to it. But in particular, if you're a fan of Sega-style games, then this might be a great fit. Now also on the left side, we've got our back and home buttons. These are Android function buttons. So if we tap it, it'll go back, and then if we press it for a couple seconds, it'll do a home function. And then also we've got one of our two front-facing stereo speakers, which we will test here in a moment. Before that, let's talk about the right side. So we have our face buttons here. Now these are surprisingly flat. As you can see right here, they are not very rounded on the front, but I wouldn't classify the buttons themselves as being sharp. They do taper off in a nice way. Now, an interesting note about these face buttons is that we have the PlayStation symbols in the center right here. So even though it does have an ABXY layout, you can see that we also have that option too. Now, contrary to the D-pad, these face buttons are micro switches. So if you press down on them, they barely go down and then they just kind of click to register. And so they do feel like they are closer to something like a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con than an old retro button. Let me give you a quick audio sample of what these sound like as well. So overall, I like these face buttons. I think they are better than, say, for example, a dome switch button, which usually requires a little bit more actuation force. And so they're very light to the touch and very easy to press down on. I also like that these are not like super small buttons. They're actually kind of large. My only main complaint about them is that I wish that they weren't so closely placed together. I feel like if we had had just a little bit more space between the buttons, it would be more comfortable overall. Now finally, on the bottom, we have our select and start buttons. These do feel like they are dome switch, or at least have some sort of rubber connection right here if they are micro switches. So they do have a bit of a mushier and thunkier feel to them compared to the very light actuation force on these micro switches. Next, let's do an audio test with these front-facing speakers at 100% volume. Okay, so first impression is the audio is quite loud. In fact, probably louder than you actually need it to be. In addition, I like that they are front-facing, and I think it does sound actually pretty good. It obviously lacks bass, but that's pretty typical with a device this size. I also like the placement of the speakers, because no matter how I hold it, I'm not going to cover up the speaker holes, which means that everything is going to sound nice and clear. So overall, from an audio perspective, I think it is pretty good. Okay, let's take a look at the top. So we have our exhaust vent right here, and the intake is going to be right here on the back. And then we have a bunch of I/O buttons. We have a power button, volume up and down, and then we have a menu button. This is also an Android function button. And then finally, other than that, we have our inline shoulders and triggers. Now, these are also micro switches, and so they have a very kind of clicky feel to them, but they do feel like they are at least dampened a little bit more than the face buttons. Let's do a quick audio test of these as well. Okay, so overall, yeah, they're a little bit on the loud side, but not as bad as I've seen previously with other devices, and they are easy to press down on, so I like that. Now, we don't have anything on the sides, and so let's just look at the bottom. So we have our LED indicator light right here. This will turn on when you charge it. Then we have our 3.5mm headphone jack, our USB-C for charging, and then a micro SD card slot. And really, that's about it when it comes to the overall hardware and I/O. Let's move on and talk about the size and overall ergonomics. Now, in terms of size, I found this to be a pretty pocketable device, all things considered. Bear in mind, obviously, that I'm wearing shorts with larger pockets. But compared to the more prominent grips on the RG Cube, I would rather use the Unicorn for actually putting in my pocket and taking around on travel. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't really mind the fact that we don't have these super big ergonomic grips because I like it being flat. That allows me to shift my hand down and be able to play with the D-pad, and I think that is an added bonus. So overall, when it comes to ergonomics, I find this to be pretty comfortable, especially when it comes to more D-pad-centric gaming, just because it is a little bit more flat. Now, when it comes to playing more modern games, for example, here with Destiny 2 streaming over Xbox, this is not a very fun experience. Number one, it's a little bit flat feeling just overall because we don't have those ergonomic grips, but then also these inline shoulder and trigger buttons just don't make it a very easy experience. Trying to aim and shoot is just not as comfortable as with stacked shoulders and triggers. In addition, all these modern games are going to play in a 16:9 aspect ratio, which honestly just doesn't look very good on a square screen like this. Even though this is a 4-inch display, it just feels rather small altogether. And so just in terms of ergonomics as well as the screen, I wouldn't really recommend using this for more modern games. I've also found it to be pretty comfortable when using an analog stick-centric game, playing like Nintendo 64 or Sega Dreamcast. Because the analog stick is in a more natural position, these kind of games feel really natural as well. And given the fact that this is the majority of the games that are going to be able to play on this chipset, I think it's a good match. Okay, let's do a few size comparisons. We'll start with the most obvious RG Cube. And yeah, in terms of just overall shape and size, they're almost identical, other than the RG Cube is a little bit thicker. Next, we have the Powkiddy RGB30. This one also is of similar size and shape, but a lot more squarish. And this one also has the same 720 by 720 4-inch display. Now, if you're in the market for a 4-inch device, specifically for retro gaming, then another one worth considering is the Anbernic RG40XXH. This one came out a couple weeks ago, but as you can see, it has a 4:3 aspect ratio display instead of square. And so even though these are both technically 4-inch devices, I would say that the Anbernic one is a little bit more of a natural fit because of that 4:3 aspect ratio. But there are all sorts of other benefits from using a square screen, which we will talk about later. Now, in terms of weight, this is 253 grams. That makes it just a tiny bit lighter than the RG Cube, but still quite a bit heavier than something like the RGB30 as well as the Anbernic RG40XXH. Okay, next let's talk about the screen. And first thing here is that the RG Cube had a lot of light bleed at the corners, and we talked a lot about that in my RG Cube reviews. Now, I haven't found any light bleed with the A1 Unicorn, but again, you just have to bear in mind this is a sample size of 1, and chances are this was a cherry-picked device for me for review. So at least with my initial testing, yeah, I'm not seeing the same light bleed problems that I had with the Anbernic device, but again, who knows? We'll have to wait until the whole community gets their hands on this device before we know for sure. Now, in terms of colors and saturation, it looks basically identical to me between these two. And chances are they are probably using very similar panels, if not from the same manufacturer. However, one thing I did notice is that the overall brightness range is better on the RG Cube versus the A1 Unicorn. For example, at max brightness, you can see that the RG Cube is quite a bit brighter. It even washes out my entire screen here on this camera. Now, it's not to say that the brightness on the device is bad. In fact, when playing indoors, I think it's perfectly fine. However, when it comes to playing outdoors, you're probably going to want to stick to playing it within some sort of shade. I had a similar experience when it came to playing in the dark. These are both at minimum brightness, and you can see that the RG Cube is almost imperceptible compared to the Unicorn. In fact, just last night I was testing some games in bed and I found it to be way too bright in a really dark environment like that. There are things you can do like turning on night light mode as well as use the extra dim setting, but even then I found it to be too bright. So if you are looking for something with a better dynamic range, then I think that the RG Cube is going to be better in that regard. Now, another thing worth noting, the company sent me over 2 different cases. We have a hard shell case and then this rubber case as well. So the idea here is that you can put the device inside of this rubber shell and it's supposed to help protect it. To be honest, I don't really see the point of this. It does give it a little bit more of a grippy feel, but in general, I don't know. I just don't think I need a rubber bumper around my handheld. It almost feels like a case you would put on a phone. Now, this hard shell case I can definitely get behind. This will fit either with the rubber bumper or without, and I like that it's nice and thin and perfectly form-fitting for the device itself. And obviously a lot of care went into this design too. It's got the ZPG logo, it's got the name of the device on it and everything. And so I do like this hard shell case, but the rubber case, I'm not really sold on it. Either way, it is nice to see that they are offering accessories like this with the device. And I think if you can pick up this hard shell case and it's pretty cheap, it's definitely worth it. Okay, next let's talk about the software experience with the device. It is an Android-based handheld. It's running Android 13, and it does come pre-installed with some emulators if you would like. When I first set up the device, which unfortunately I didn't film, it did show me a couple options with pre-installed configurations. So for example, PSP as well as Citra. Now I did try those out and I found that they were okay. A lot of them had to do with like overlays specific to that console. But in general, I didn't find any sort of performance improvement of those compared to just getting them from the Play Store. So personally, what I did is I just wiped everything, and then because it has Google Play Store already installed on it, I just went and added all of my own games and emulators myself. And so this is what it looks like after I've set everything up. I've got a just typical Android interface, and I can go through and launch any of my apps from here. I also did take the time to set up Emulation Station Desktop Edition, and I've made videos about this before, but this is what the setup looks like now. I'm using a new theme right here. And the theme is called Canvas, and you can install it directly from the theme downloader. But what I really like about it is that it actually accommodates a 1:1 aspect ratio. Not only that, it has a more grid-like setup, and so I can just navigate through my various systems like this, and then I can go inside and actually choose my game. And so I really like this setup right here, and I think it's just a really nice fit for a square device like this. Now, if you want something that's a little bit more traditional looking, they do have the Art Book Next one in the theme downloader too, and so you can always have an interface like this as well. Really, when it comes down to it, this is one of my favorite things about Emulation Station, is that you can really change the look and feel of the device depending on the theme that you choose. And it is pretty cool that we have more than one square aspect ratio theme to choose from. Now the canvas theme also has a bunch of different theme variations like this one, and so I really like the fact that we can customize the overall look and feel of our device. For example, this Famicom one also looks pretty neat, and I think it's really fitting with the overall color scheme of this device. Now one thing to keep in mind just by virtue of being an Android-based device is that the setup for this is going to take quite a bit of time. You've got to download and install all of your emulators, connect them to your games, use a front end like Emulation Station. All that is going to take quite some time. It's the very first time you've ever set up a device. It can take several days to get it all tweaked perfectly. Meanwhile, a Linux-based device like the RGB30 is going to be a little bit easier to set up initially. That's because a lot of the custom firmwares, like the one I'm using here called Rocknix, does a lot of that work for you. You really just have to add all of your games and it takes care of the rest. And I've got starter guides both for the RGB30 as well as Android in general, and each of those will apply, but it is something to be mindful of, is that there's a lot of upfront work when it comes to Android just to make it feel a little bit more like a gaming console. Whereas with a Linux-based device, it's just going to feel more like a console right out of the box. So next I want to talk about just overall performance and what you can expect when it comes to playing games on the Unicorn. Now there's a lot to talk about when it comes to playing on a square aspect ratio screen, and I've covered that extensively in both my Powkitty RGB30 as well as my RGCube videos, and so I'm going to reference some of those and really just talk specifically about the Unicorn and what you can expect. And also bear in mind that I've already pre-configured all of my systems here. I did that last night, and I did it all following kind of the suggestions that I made in my Powkitty RGB30 starter guide because that did focus on a square screen. Okay, so let's start with Game Boy, and I think this is a really excellent fit for this device. The Game Boy originally played at a 10:9 aspect ratio, which is very square-like, and because we're playing it on a square screen, that means we have minimal black bars at the top and the bottom. And so playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color games is a really good fit when it comes down to it. Now there are other systems besides just Game Boy and Game Boy Color that will also look really good on this device, and that includes things like Neo Geo Pocket Color as well as Game Gear. Basically anything with a squarish aspect ratio is just going to look really fitting on this screen. And so when it comes to playing some of these older handheld systems, it's just a really good fit, much like how it is with the RGB30 and the RGCube. Now when it comes to playing 4x3 systems, things like Sega Genesis or maybe the original NES, all these are also going to look pretty good, but just bear in mind that 4x3 is going to give you larger bezels on the top and bottom compared to a more squarish aspect ratio. And because it's a 4-inch screen, you're going to get about 3.5 inches of overall screen real estate when it comes to playing 4x3 content. That means that the overall image is not going to be any bigger than the 3.5-inch 4x3 aspect ratio devices that are available on the market. Also bear in mind that overall this screen does have larger bezels on the bottom compared to the top and the sides, and this was exactly like how it was with the RGB30. And if this is something that bothers you, the Anbernic RGCube does have more balanced bezels altogether. Now for some systems, like Super Nintendo as well as TurboGrafx-16, I recommend using an 8:7 aspect ratio and then using integer scale overscale. This is going to give you a little bit of cutoff pixels on the left and right, but most of the games originally did accommodate for that lost screen real estate. And so what ends up happening is that you have something that is very close to a square aspect ratio that fills up a bunch of the screen and it's integer scaled, and so it's going to look amazing. And so if you're a huge fan of playing Super Nintendo and TurboGrafx-16, I think this is a great fit as well. Now if you'd like, you can also do this with NES. You can set it up to be 8:7 instead of 4:3, but for me personally, I found that 4:3 is just a little bit more natural feeling, and it's probably because I grew up playing this on a 4:3 television, but for me, yeah, this just looks a little bit squished for my tastes. But it's really going to be up to you. If you prefer to have just as much screen real estate as possible, and you want to also have integer scaling, then this will also work. Just bear in mind that some games, no matter what, will get cut off on the left and right, especially with NES. And so for example, here you can see with Castlevania, we're not getting the full text on the left and right. So this is one of those cases where, yeah, you don't want to use any sort of overscale so that way you can still see everything on the left and right as the developers intended. Now, as we start moving into some of the harder to play systems, let's talk a little bit about performance and what you can expect from this chipset compared to something like the RGCube. And first thing to note, within the top-down menu of the Unicorn, we do have different performance modes to choose from. However, I did find that there really wasn't any sort of performance difference between any of these three. In fact, when doing a 3D Mark Wildlife stress test, I found that the performance marks were about the same. Now there's also a fan that you can turn on, and there's just one setting, either on or off. And the fan itself is relatively quiet, but I don't think it's doing a lot of work anyway. Again, if we go back to the wildlife stress test, we can see that even with the fan off, the temperature is relatively cool at about 38 degrees max when having it off. Meanwhile, when turning it on, it only goes down about 3 degrees altogether. And honestly, as long as it's not getting up to like the 80s or 90s, I'm good with it either way. So in general, it just feels like this chip is running pretty coolly and doesn't really need that fan in the first place. And of note, at any time while playing, I never got any sort of ambient heat from the device either. Now, when it comes to the overall score, it's about 1265 or so when it comes to wildlife stress test. And that's a little bit less than half as performant as the RG Cube. However, I wouldn't really characterize the performance on the Unicorn as being necessarily bad. I actually think it's pretty good for what it's intended to play. So let's go ahead and start with PlayStation 1 and then work our way up and see what kind of limits we can reach. Now, one thing I did in my testing in particular is that I tried to play everything within RetroArch if possible. So when it comes to Nintendo 64, PlayStation, and Dreamcast, I preferred to play them on RetroArch so that way I had universal hotkeys. And so you will likely get better performance if you try to use a standalone emulator, but for me I was looking for a more seamless experience. And to start, when it comes to PlayStation 1, here I am playing with the PCSX rearmed core, but with enhanced resolution, which means it's going to run at 480p. And here I found that no problem, I could play any game at a full 60 frames per second, and so all the games played at full speed for me. Okay, next let's talk about Nintendo DS. This is one that I do recommend using with the standalone Drastic emulator as opposed to RetroArch just because performance will be a lot better. And here I'm playing everything at a high resolution setting, which means that it's going to look a little bit upscaled, and I think it looks really great. And these 1:1 aspect ratio displays actually do pretty well when it comes to scaling on a Nintendo DS and 3DS game. And that's because we can put them top to bottom, and we can put, the bottom screen a little bit smaller to give us more space, and I think it still looks pretty good. Not only that, this screen is capable of touch input, which is going to work really well with DS and 3DS games. So honestly, when it comes to playing these types of games on an Android-based handheld, this might be one of the best out there when it comes to DS gameplay. Your only other option would be to get a really widescreen device and then play them side by side, but me personally, I like to play them top and bottom. Now, Nintendo 64 was a bit of a mixed experience. So for the most part, yes, I could play everything at full speed, but there were certain games that did not play at full speed, at least within RetroArch. And again, here I'm playing everything at a 480p resolution. I could upscale this a little bit more to take advantage of the 720p screen, but I like the idea of playing everything at a native resolution since we are playing a lot of these retro-focused systems. Now, when it comes to the harder to play Nintendo 64 games, things like Cruisin' USA and GoldenEye, these can also play just fine at a 480p resolution, but you will need to use the standalone Mupen 64 emulator as opposed to RetroArch. And so really it's going to be up to you whether or not you want to just play everything within Mupen or just choose to play some games in RetroArch or others within Mupen. Either way, when it comes down to it, I would say that yes, Nintendo 64 is perfectly capable of being played on this device. And by the way, you can set up your emulators on a per game basis in Emulation Station. For example, with Cruisin' USA, I can just press select and then go down to the edit this game's metadata. From there, if I go all the way down to the bottom, there's an option for alternative emulator. And from there, I can just choose whichever one I want to load per game. And so I have it turned on to play RetroArch by default, but if I want, for certain games, I can set this up for Mupen 64 instead. Now, playing Dreamcast is a very similar experience. I prefer to play everything in RetroArch, again, just because I have those universal hotkeys, but this will also play really well. It's not going to play at a full 60 frames per second, but you will be able to turn on the auto frame skip, and it's going to be a pretty playable experience, all things considered. Also bear in mind that I'm playing this at the native 480p resolution as opposed to upscaling it. Now, same thing here. If you're playing a game and it just doesn't feel as good as you would like it to be, maybe because the auto frame skip is a little bit much, or maybe it's just not even playing at full speed, then you can try out the standalone emulator. So here I'm trying out Redream, and it's working just fine. So either way, just like with Nintendo 64, I would say the Dreamcast is perfectly playable on this device and chipset. Now for PSP, it's a little bit trickier. Most games will play just fine at a native resolution, but it's a 16:9 system, which means that it's not going to look very good. It's going to look a little bit small. And this is very similar to trying to play a modern 16:9 game like game streaming. It just isn't a very good fit for a 1:1 aspect ratio display. Now in terms of performance, I did find that PSP is relatively playable. I got a little bit of slowdown in games like Outrun 2006, but in general I would say that everything just seemed to play pretty well. Now I don't want to call this a PSP system just because the screen is so small, but from a performance standpoint, yes, you can play most games at a native resolution. Now when it comes to God of War Chains of Olympus, this one will get some slowdown here and there down to like 58 frames per second, But overall, I would say this is still a playable experience, just bear in mind this is at a native resolution. So I'm a little bit mixed about the whole PSP thing, but yes, you can definitely play it on this device for the most part. Now, when it comes to Sega Saturn, I found that it's kind of a mixed bag. There were many games that played at full speed, including Nights into Dreams, and this was actually a really great experience. Now, some other games like Panzer Dragoon are almost there, but just not quite. This one averages around 56 frames per second, and so you will definitely feel that slowdown and the audio stuttering as well. And so this is one of those things, again, where you may want to try out the standalone emulator and a couple different emulation hacks to see if you can get it a little bit better. But for the most part, I would say don't rely on 100% Sega Saturn with this system. Instead, this might fall into the category of being a happy bonus altogether. And sadly, Nintendo 3DS performance is not quite up to speed either. Here I'm using Lime 3DS emulator, and it's mostly running at full speed, but I have to play it at a native resolution, which does look pretty pixelated and blocky. I'm also using a custom scaling profile. I have all this information in my RG Cube guide because I did the same thing on that device as well. But unfortunately, compared to the RG Cube, this one just quite isn't there in terms of performance. There are plenty of games that just won't run at full speed. A good example is going to be Super Mario 3D Land. This is a game that plays pretty well on the RG Cube at a 2x resolution, but here at a 1x resolution on the Unicorn, I can barely get it to play at full speed. It's usually going to drop down to about 80% speed in certain parts, and so I wouldn't really consider this game to be fully playable. And so I think this is a pretty good example of the performance that you can get with 3DS on the Unicorn. It's just not going to be quite as good because it's running at a lower resolution and not playing at full speed. So for me personally, I would just rather play these games on the RG Cube all around. Okay, next up, let's talk about Generation 6. We'll start with Nintendo GameCube. There are going to be plenty of games that will play at full speed, or at least with just a little bit of slowdown. And so something like Mario Kart, yeah, this is going to be great. Now, when it comes to middle tier games, things like NBA Street, I found this one also played fairly well. I did get some graphical glitches here and there, but otherwise I think it was actually a pretty good experience. And in terms of performance speed, it was something very close to full speed as well. And same thing with Soul Calibur 2, I would consider this to be fully playable. And bear in mind that I'm just using the official Dolphin emulator and also using NTSC ROMs, which means they're going to play at 60 frames per second. Now, once you get up to the harder to play games like F-Zero GX, this one gets a little bit more challenging. It actually plays pretty well, very close to 60 frames per second, but you will get some pretty heavy dips down to like 55 frames per second here and there. And considering that most people who really enjoy this game probably want to play it at full speed, this is not going to be an ideal experience. At that point, you've got a few options. You can try out a PAL ROM, which is only going to play at 50 frames per second, or you can try out like the MMJ version of Dolphin, or you can also just go in and change the internal clock speed of the CPU in GameCube, and sometimes that'll fix it with certain chipsets when playing this game. Either way, I don't want to say this is a perfect GameCube experience, but I would say that about 75% of games will be relatively playable without a bunch of emulation hacks to get them working. And so this is probably the first major difference between the RG Cube and the Unicorn, because I would consider the RG Cube to be a GameCube capable handheld, whereas the Unicorn, it's more like an added bonus if anything. Long story short, I wouldn't buy this device in order to play GameCube, although it is fairly close. Now, when it comes to PlayStation 2, it's going to be a little bit less performant than GameCube, and so there will be plenty of games that'll play just fine, including like Final Fantasy X. Really, I would say about 50% of games with PlayStation 2 will be playable to some degree. You may have to do some emulation hacks like turning on underclocking, but in general, I would say that you can play a lot of PS2 games on this device, just not all of them. To give you an idea of the upper threshold when playing PlayStation 2, games like Ratchet & Clank do not play at full speed. They get a lot of slowdown in the larger areas, and so this is about the upper threshold right here. You can play all the way up to maybe Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, and then you're going to run into problems. Same thing with like sports games. I wouldn't expect to be able to play any of the mid-2000s like NFL or NBA games at all. So really, when we're talking about games that do play it reliably at full speed, it's going to be more light action games, you know, things like role-playing games as well. But I would not count on some of those heavy-hitting hits. So again, I think this is probably one of the main differences between the Unicorn and the Cube. The Cube is going to be able to play PlayStation 2 and GameCube somewhat reliably, whereas the Unicorn is going to be a little bit more hit and miss, and it'll be really up to you and the games that you want to play. And so to put it in the most simple terms, I would say that the RG Cube is a PlayStation 2 and GameCube capable device, whereas I would not say the same about the Unicorn. Okay, and one last note when it comes to just overall gaming is that you can also play Android games on this device, considering the fact that it is an Android-based handheld. Just bear in mind that not every game is going to scale correctly to a 1:1 aspect ratio like we're seeing here with Stardew Valley. But all things considered, if you do want to play, Android-based games on this device, it's more than capable of doing that. Okay, we ended up doing a lot more testing than I initially anticipated, and so I thought this was going to be a short and quick review, but obviously it's turning into a lot more than that. I just can't make a short review. I always have to go into the details. Either way, let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the ZPG A1 Unicorn. As always, we'll start with what I like, and I think this device is actually pretty comfortable. I understand that a lot of people would probably like to have the D-pad up top or vice versa, but honestly, with a design like this, I didn't even really notice at all. The fact that we have somewhat shallow grips allows me to shift my hand as needed, and so that makes it a very comfortable experience for me. I also really like the face buttons in particular on this device. They feel super precise and very easy to the touch. It is a little bit odd to use something with micro switches, but I got used to it really quickly. I also found that the device runs relatively cool. In fact, there is a fan on it, but I never actually turn it on ever. Even when trying to play high-end Generation 6 games, I found it to still be okay without the fan. I also found the performance to be mostly good, especially up to Generation 5 or Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. Those are platforms that just feel like they're made to be played on this device. Everything past that's a little bit more tricky. I also think that for having a 4-inch screen, this is a pretty good size overall. I would consider this device to be pocketable. And I also think that the price point is just about right. If you go on AliExpress right now, it's around $180, and that's because we're seeing a lot of markup from third-party suppliers. However, when this officially launches from the company, it's going to be around $130 or $140 after shipping. And I think considering the quality of the handheld that we're getting, which really doesn't have any deal breakers, but then also the performance up to Gen 5, that's about right for me. You can definitely find devices for around $150 that will play more GameCube and PS2, but I think if you're really focusing on things like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and maybe Nintendo DS, that's a pretty good price point for what you're getting. Now, of course, this is not a perfect device, so there's a couple things I don't like about it. The first are these analog sticks. And I think we're just at the point where I'm over using any of these Nintendo Switch Joy-Con style sticks. We've seen a lot better sticks from other companies like Retroid and AYN, so I'm hoping they will get adopted more as time goes on. Another thing about this device is that it's just on the cusp of being fully playable with GameCube and PS2. And so I found myself somewhat being teased about the performance with those systems in particular. A good amount of games are going to play just fine, but there are plenty of games that I would love to play on this device that I really just can't without using a lot of hacks. And so when it comes to Generation 6 gameplay, it does feel a bit like a tease. And finally, the other concern that I have about this device is overall availability. Because ZPG is basically a one-man show, we're relying on a single point of failure. And so even though I do fully expect that another big batch of these devices will be dropping here pretty soon, who knows 6 months from now. And so it almost feels like this device is more for collectors than for your everyday handheld enthusiast. And so in wrapping up, you're probably wondering whether or not I even just recommend the ZPG A1 Unicorn in the first place. And I think a lot of that comes down to your own personal play preferences and what you're looking to get out of a handheld like this. For example, like I mentioned in the intro, I do think this device is kind of like an upgraded or super version of the Powkiddy RGB30. When comparing these two side by side, I think that the screens are just about the same, but I do prefer the controls on this one over the RGB30. This D-pad is better, and I like these face buttons better too. In addition, the Powkiddy RGB30 was plagued with a bunch of weird charging issues, and that sometimes it wouldn't charge fully or it would deplete the battery really quickly, and those issues won't be present on Android 13 with the Unicorn. In fact, this one can also fast charge with a USB-C charger and cable. Also, the performance is going to be better on the Unicorn compared to the RGB30. The RGB30 can play most Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, whereas I would say the Unicorn can play all of them depending on which emulator you're using. Really, I can only think of two good benefits with the RGB30. This one's about half the cost. You can get it for around $70 or $80 right now, but then also because this one is Linux-based, the setup is going to be quite a bit easier on the front end, as opposed to with Android where you have to do a bunch of work up front, but then once you have it running, everything is pretty seamless. Not to mention the fact that the Android sleep mode is going to be a lot better on this device compared to the RGB30. So in general, I would say if you are looking for a square device to play more retro-focused systems all the way up to Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, then the Unicorn is definitely going to be my pick in that regard. regard. And so between these two, if you're looking for a recommendation, I would say that yeah, pick up the Unicorn if it still fits within your budget. Now when it comes to comparing the RG Cube against the Unicorn, then things are a little bit different. To start, the RG Cube has all that performance power that I would love to see in the Unicorn. So on this one, I do like playing PS2 and GameCube. I think they're a great fit for this overall handheld. I also think that the grips on the RG Cube are really comfortable, especially when playing more analog stick-centric games. It's a more natural fit. But again, if you're looking at more retro-based systems, then I think that the Unicorn is probably going to be good enough. Now these are both running Android, but I will say that the Android build seems to be better on the ZPG. For example, this one also supports over-the-air updates, so you can update this over the internet like I have with this test build. And this one does a better job of keeping your settings between reboots. I found that I always have to change out the controls on the RG Cube, whereas I don't have to do that on the Unicorn. So when it comes to deciding between these two, again, it's going to be up to you, but I think that if you do want to play GameCube and PS2, then the RG Cube is going to be a better fit. This one also has a bigger battery and these stacked shoulder buttons, which are going to be great with certain systems like GameCube. And then also, if you like RGB lights, it's got that too. So if anything, it almost feels like we're in a 3-tier system at this point. If you want the absolute cheapest square system, then the RGB 30 is still a pretty good device. But if you have the money for it, I think the Unicorn is going to give you a better experience. And then finally, of course, if you want to play the higher end systems, GameCube and PS2, I think that the additional $30 or $40 to get the RG Cube is also money well spent. So when it comes down to it, yes, I do recommend the ZPG A1 Unicorn, provided that it is available for sale and that you fall within that middle bracket. If you're looking for a device that's really good when it comes to Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and everything below that, then yeah, I think the Unicorn is great and is probably better in that regard than the RGB 30. However, if you've got the budget for it, the RG Cube can do all of that and then some, and I think it's just overall a better handheld. So anyway, that's really about it for this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are any of these three of interest to you, and which one specifically? It's kind of neat that we have such a weird aspect ratio on these handhelds, and we now have 3 different options for it. In fact, there's actually a 4th device even on the cheaper scale, which I haven't reviewed yet, but I do have here in the studio. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you have any questions down below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.